Contemplations before chanting. The Sangha is invited to come back to our breathing so that our collective energy of mindfulness will bring us together as an organism, going as a river with no more separation. Let the whole Sangha breathe as one body, chant as one body, listen as one body, and transcend the boundaries of a delusive self, liberating ourselves from the superiority complex, the inferiority complex, and the equality complex.
From the depths of understanding,
Good morning. Dear respected teacher, brothers, sisters, and siblings. We welcome each of you back this morning. Welcome to all of you, to the collective, to the community. Taking this opportunity again now to look inward and welcoming all the parts of you. We are looking to have two great teachers sharing the Dharma talks this morning with the topic, understanding and alleviating suffering of others. First, I'd like to introduce Sister Đẳng Nghiêm, or we all know as Sister D, Sister Adornment with Non-Discrimination. She was born in Vietnam in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. She was ordained at Plum Village by our dear teacher Thầy Nhật Hạnh in 2000. She is the author of multiple books, a memoir, Healing, a woman's journey from doctor who she is, or was, to the nun. Mindfulness as Medicine. Her newest book is Flowers in the Dark. Is a deeply thoughtful guidebook to healing trauma with mindfulness practice. Our second dear teacher is Kaira Jewel Lingo, is a Dharma teacher who has a lifelong interest in blending spirituality and meditation with social justice. She was a nun in the Plum Village tradition for 15 years. She was also ordained as a Dharma teacher by Thầy Nhật Hạnh in 2007. She's now also a teacher in Vipassana Insight Lineage. She especially feels called to share the Dharma with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, activists, educators, youth, artists, and families. The forthcoming book will be published by Parallax Press. It's called We Are Made for These Times, Skillfully Moving Through Change, Loss, and Disruption. As we settle in the Dharma talks this morning and continuing through the retreat, we offer another reminder to practice self-care. Be comfortable on or off screen, mindful of the mind and body and what it needs in this moment. As our dear respected teacher Thầy Nhật Hạnh said, peace in oneself, peace in the world. May peace be with you. May peace, joy, health, and happiness be with you with your mindful breathing, moment by moment. With deep gratitude and great joy, it is now my honor to welcome our teachers for this talk, Sister Đẳng Nghiêm, Sister D, and Kaira Jewel Lingo.
Dear beloved Thay, dear beloved Sangha everywhere, Sister Jewel and I planned that I would I can hear myself clearly. You can't hear me? Really? Can you hear me now? It's on. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me now? One, two, three. Is it working now? Yes. Oh, wonderful. Come on, Sam. We know the technical team is there and we are very happy and grateful. Dear beloved Thay, dear beloved community everywhere, Sister Jewel and I are very happy to be with you. I was going to introduce my sister, who has been my elder sisters all these years, 21 years now. And it's a great happiness that we continue to walk on the path and share the Dharma together. But since Go Gyao Yoda already introduced us, I would like to take a moment actually to introduce to you Go Gyao Yoda. I was so moved, surprised and moved to see her introducing us, because actually I owe a lot of gratitude to Go Gyao Yoda. When I went to a retreat in Santa Barbara in 1999, I met her in my Dharma sharing group. And soon after that, as I came home back to San Francisco to continue with my residency in medicine, I went to her house a couple of times to practice, because she was holding the practice at her home. And when my partner died suddenly, only 3 weeks after I attended that faithful retreat in Santa Barbara, Go Gyao Yoda was there for me to help with all the ceremonies for my partner. And also, when I told her that I would leave medicine and go to Plum Village to ordain, she actually bought the plane ticket for me. Yes, pretty much I told her generally I would like to go to Plum Village in January, and she just got the date, the 12th of January 2000, and she gave me the ticket. So everything that I have today, the peace, the joy, the blessed life that I have, I owe so many to Thay, to my ancestors, to my friends, and that also includes Go Gyao Yoda. Bless you, my dear. Let us enjoy 3 sounds of the bell together. Dear beloved Thay, dear beloved spiritual family, yesterday we listened to Brother Phap Dung and Joanne talking about how to understand and embrace the suffering within. And today, Sister True Jewel and I will share our understanding and practice, and how to practice and understand the suffering in each other. And as you can see, the nature of interbeing, even though Brother Phap Dung and Joanne talked about understanding and embracing the suffering within ourselves, they were also talking about families and communities, and vice versa. Today, as we talk about understanding and embracing the suffering in each other, we also talk about the suffering within ourselves. So that is true to the nature of interbeing. And Sister True Jewel and I also decided to have this as a dialogue. We use the description that the OI organizing team so thoughtfully and wisely planned out for us, and we turned the descriptions into questions. So in that spirit, my sister will pose the first question for me.
Thank you, dear sister, for getting the foundation laid for us. And so, dear Sister D, if you could share about what some of the causes and conditions are that, despite our good intentions, they result in compounding the suffering of those we wish to serve.
Dear community, my dear sister, I trust that all of us have very good intentions as spiritual practitioners, as doctors, as teachers, as social workers, healthcare professionals, etc. We all have very good intentions to help others. But we, more often than not, we get burned out, and we can become quite bitter. And I have seen cases where the ones who are supposed to help actually turn around and belittle or even abuse those that they make the commitment to help. And I see the root of it is the unawareness of our own suffering, of our own prejudices and biases. So I'll use my life as an example. I was born during the Vietnam War, and so was my brother, to an American serviceman and to a Vietnamese mother. And so we were Amerasian children. And growing up, I learned very quickly that Amerasian children were not valued in Vietnam. We looked different. My brother actually had blonde hair and very light skin. And so he stood out more than I did. But I experienced his pain nonetheless, because children would curse at him. They would spit on his head as he was sitting on the floor playing. They play many cruel games. So as I was growing up, I learned that it was not attractive, desirable to be an Amerasian. As much as I loved my brother, and I am glad that I was never ashamed of my brother, because he was the world to me. He meant the world to me. But I actually never brought my brother to my school or to my friends in general. Only my good friends who came to my house knew about my brother. And later, with more awareness, as I came to the US, I recognized that I was shy. I shied away from people in my school who were of a darker skin, especially African American students and Mexican students. And at one point, as I went to college, there were also young men who were very attracted to me and who were people of color. And I liked them. I appreciated them. But I was afraid to have a friendship with them, let alone to have a commitment with them. And I realized that growing up, I knew it was a source of suffering to look different from others. And I didn't want to bring that upon myself. So I associated the darker skin color with suffering, with being unwanted. And it was in high school when I went to a camp called Anytown Camp, when they selected high school students from different schools and from different races, ethnic backgrounds, religions, and we had a great blast. 5 days together, playing, singing, going to workshops. We were so happy together. And then on the last day, they decided to divide us into different groups. So we weren't allowed to eat together. So the black kids ate separately, the Asian kids ate separately, and the white kids ate separately. And that was the very first time when I felt this deep pain from separation, because I had such good experiences with them. And so when suddenly we were divided and based on the color of our skin, it was so painful to me that I realized why all my life I avoided Asian American, American children, and then people of different colors when they came to the US. That was my first raised awareness, and it changed. It changed the way I look at myself and others. And I want to share with you briefly about now more of us start to talk about bias. We see that in the word bias, there's the word bi, means two. In Vietnamese, it's thiên vị, bias. It's a dualistic view, dual, that's two. About one versus the other. So a bias is an inclination in favor of or against something, a person, or a group of people. So in favor of or against. Something, a person, or a group of people, or animals, plants, minerals, Mother Earth. A bias. implicit and true to the nature of interbeing. In the explicit bias means something that we are aware of. We are aware of our prejudices, of our preferences, of our inclinations. And implicit, we're not even aware of them. And so true to the nature of interbeing, in the explicit biases, of course, there must be the implicit biases. For me to avoid other people, even Vietnamese people, for many years living in the US, I avoided Vietnamese people. I didn't want to be associated with them because so that's something that I was vaguely aware of. But there was also things that I consciously chose to associate more with my Caucasian friends. And it's all based on this survival instinct. We all want to survive. What is the best way to survive? To associate ourselves with those who have more, who are in more favor, advantageous conditions. We want to associate ourselves with that. And we want to disassociate ourselves with those who may cause us suffering. And so that's just natural as a human tendency. And so in that way, when we try to help others, just like many of us who go into psychology, if you ask us, most of us have suffering in our life. So we want to understand ourselves, we want to help others, we want to go to the health professions, we want to do social justice. And yet, we have so many implicit biases and explicit biases that go unexamined, and they will manifest, whether we are aware of them or not, like whether I was aware of the suffering, of the lessons that I learned very early in life, what would help me to survive in this world, and what would take away that chance for me to live. These biases were embedded in us and affect us in our thoughts and speech and bodily actions. But if we're not aware of them, then as we try to help people, they will manifest, and people will feel it, will hear it from us, and will see it through our actions. Just like a woman, she shared her husband, they are an African-American couple, and he had so many symptoms, and the woman brought her husband to the doctors, and it happened that all these doctors were non-African Americans, and they did all the tests specifically for black people, and they could not find a cause. And usually, most of the tests, that they did on him was the HIV testing, illnesses known in the black population. So finally, she was so desperate, and she said to one doctor, she said, "Can you test for my husband what you would test for white people? Please." And he did, that doctor did. And they found that this man, this husband, he had lymphoma, just like everybody else. But for months, he went on undiagnosed because the doctors had good intention to help, but they weren't aware of their own biases. Yes, black people, young people, they're at risk for sexual misconduct, for HIV, etc., etc. So they would just focus in certain areas and not others. So that is how, when we are unaware of our own suffering, we do not examine and transform and heal our pain, which have cultivate these biases in us, then even with good intention, we cause others at the least discomfort and at the most more suffering, more injury. So with that, I will stop for now. So dear Suki, now it's my turn to ask you a question. How can we grow our understanding of our biases and discriminations? And also, can you share a personal experience with it, of this?
Thank you, Sister. So I want to actually begin by describing what Sister D and I look like for those who may not be able to see us well. I just learned about this listening to a workshop online where the teacher started out by describing the visual field. And it was a big, a window opened in my mind of like, oh, I never thought to think about what it would be like to be someone who couldn't see us well, and how that they would be more welcomed in to the presentation, to the experience, if they knew what it looked like. So Sister D, who you just heard, is sitting on a dais and in brown robes with a brown headscarf, and she has glasses on. And behind her is a beautiful altar with many purple orchid flowers. And she's in a big hall in Deer Park Monastery in the south of California, filled with some people and lots of windows and light. And I am seated in my home in Long Island, New York. I'm wearing a fuchsia dress and a reddish jacket, and I have curly black hair that's the length of my chin, and I also am wearing glasses. Behind me is a green plant and a painting of Martin Luther King Jr. with a halo around his head. So what I just did is one of the ways we can grow our understanding of our bias and discrimination, is by making conscious the things that we otherwise wouldn't be aware of, as Sister D so beautifully described about implicit bias. So I like to use the image of a circle with a line across. Many of us recognize such an image from our teacher. But in this case, similar to our teacher's diagram, the line represents, through the middle of the circle, represents above it is what we know, what we're aware of, and below the circle is what we're not aware of in ourselves. So it's the implicit bias, all of the things that are unconscious to us, but that exist in us. And so to look at this question of how do we grow in our understanding of our bias, the I think the real goal of our practice, the real awakening for all of us, is to help that line that's sometimes at the top of the circle, sometimes at the middle. It's just to help it come further down so that more and more of what's below gets revealed. Similar to an iceberg. An iceberg in the ocean, we see the top 10%. The whole 90% is submerged under the water. But the way we grow is to know that 90% is what we don't see. So we need to know what we don't know. We need to recognize that so much about us we don't know, and we need to be committed to learning to see it and honor the bigness, the vastness of what we don't know. That's one beautiful line from our sutras. The Bodhisattva is always learning new things, never thinks that we know everything we need to know. So we live in a racialized world, as Sister Dhangyam's stories just now express. And we're all conditioned by the distortion of race, whether we want to be or not. There's a test from Harvard University. It's something I think all of us should take, this implicit bias test, where it happens so fast, you don't really get to choose. You just have to click, and then you see the things you prefer, the things you don't prefer. And even, it's surprising to many people who take the test. They explicitly, they don't think they have this bias, but the test is so precise and skillful that it shows you the things you don't want to be biased about, but you are. And it's not because we chose that or we wanted that. It's because we got it by osmosis. We are humans. We want to be comfortable. We want to be safe. We have the mammalian brain. And so, as Sister Dee was saying, we will side with whatever group, whatever characteristic keeps us safer, keeps us more comfortable, having more choices. So we also live in not only a racialized world, we live in a patriarchal world, and we live in a human-centered world. We're colonized by all of these distortions of separation between, who is acceptable, what is not acceptable, who is not acceptable. We live in a heterosexist society that privileges those who are heterosexual. We live in a society that privileges those that identify with their gender at birth, so cisgendered, centered. So all of these things we want to decolonize. And we can have internalized oppression, as Sister Dee spoke of herself, discriminating against people like her. So that can be the case if we have any identity that is less privileged. We may want to distance ourselves from other people with that identity because it's painful to be less privileged. But if we have privilege, we also want to recognize that, own that, and work to interrupt it, to not benefit from it unconsciously. So whether we have privilege or don't have privilege in any particular aspect of our identity, the idea is to get more and more aware of how it operates in us and in the world around us with great compassion. And we need a lot of study and energy to do this kind of unlearning. We have to unlearn what has been deeply embedded in us. And it's exactly the way the Buddha described. My path is a path that goes upstream. Our whole society is going downstream, about one group colonizing, oppressing another group. Whoever has privilege living at the expense of whoever doesn't have privilege. But our spiritual path is to go upstream against that tendency to live off of another because of our privilege. So if we have privilege, we don't need to deny it or feel guilty about it, but we can make reparations. We use our privilege to lift up those that have less privilege. We can take trainings that compassionately and even joyfully, I feel this work is joyful work. We can think about talking about race, talking about patriarchy is so heavy, it's so painful, and it is. It's our deepest traumas are in these things. But imagine when we get free of them, how good that feels. When we learn to be a bit more free, a bit less caught in these views that have caused so much pain. That is a great joy. So we should think about this work as a privilege to even be on this path of unlearning, of decolonizing. And it can be so inspiring. And so that gives us energy. So I think, in terms of racial privilege, looking at, understanding, growing more aware of white supremacy and decolonizing our minds around race, I really think part of our OI path is to take white awareness trainings if you identify as white, and to take trainings about healing internalized oppression if you identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color. I think if we're not doing these decolonizing practices and studies in community, we cannot fulfill the vision of the OI. So the tree of the OI, it keeps growing, and in this new time, this moment of time, new branches are coming forth, and to be responsive to what's alive in this world right now, I think this is all of our work in this community. So the last thing I'll say is that it's very important to see where we fall on the axis of privilege. I can provide a graphic, maybe it can be on the website for later, but there's at the center, if you think of the center is power. And the further you get from the center is less power. So the center is what is valued, and further away from the center is what is devalued. And think of lines going through that center, and each line represents some aspect of our identity. So it could be race, and so lighter skin is closer to the center, darker skin is closer to the edge. There's axis of economics. So more money you have, more privilege, more power, less money. There's the axis of what language you grew up speaking. What's your mother tongue, especially in this country, in the US. Axis of what gender you love. What's your sexual orientation? So many different axes of privilege. And we each have areas where we're privileged and areas where we're not privileged. I may experience discrimination because of my race as a BIPOC person, but I experience privilege being English speaking, being born in this country, being economically secure, being heterosexual and cisgendered. So we all have different ways that we have power and don't have power. And the thing that's so important to know is that wherever, it's good to study and map yourself, put a dot wherever you see you have privilege on one line or don't have privilege, for each one. Because the places where we have privilege blind us to the experience of people who don't have privilege in that area. We will never think about how it would be like for someone who doesn't have that, because we've always had it and we think it's normal. We think our experience is normal. So, my partner struggled a lot coming to this country to learn the language as a teen, and do many of the basic things that I took for granted that were easy for me as a person born in the US. Like, I could get a driver's license. It was so easy. I didn't have any problems getting a driver's license. My citizenship was accounted for because I was born in this country. My interactions with the government, governmental things, I didn't do that much because I was in the monastery for so many years, but those things did not bring me any anxiety. Whereas for him, he told me how difficult it was for him just to get a driver's license, just to, the process of becoming a citizen. And it was so much anxiety anytime he or his family had to interact with anything related to the authorities. And his, his parents were also, not so good in English. He was trying to learn English and translate for them. So all these things I realized I didn't know until I really got to know his situation, how easy it was for me, how privileged I was to have so much access without fear, that it's a very important part of living in this society, right? Being able to drive and to have your identity and your papers all straight. So it's so helpful whenever we can have friends who kindly point out to us where we are not seeing our privilege, how we are assuming what we have is what everyone has. And that's so easy to do. It's so easy to be biased. I remember as a nun, I was asked to share about how a sister was doing in the community, and she wasn't doing very well, and many sisters felt that she wasn't doing well. And I was sharing this with Sister Chung Kong, and Sister Chung Kong said, "Don't judge, don't judge." And I was like, oh. I thought because I had the whole, many other people behind me, that we all had this sense about this happening, that I was somehow in the right, I was standing on solid ground, that it wasn't just my view. But Sister Chung Kong could see I had a bias. She could see that there was more to the story about what was going on. And she was inviting me to look more deeply, just because, we see something. Maybe what we see has some part of the truth, but we may not see the whole truth about that person. And it's also very easy when we're in a group and influenced by others to close down and to think we know, and to put someone in a box and think we have the complete story about them. But this is rarely the case. And so I'm so grateful for that teaching of her in a situation that I thought was obvious. She was pointing out, there's more. So one last piece is just to notice that there is a very real difference between our intention and the impact. That's another thing we can grow our awareness of. Sometimes, and I know I've done this a lot in my life, that if I make a mistake and it hurts someone or it causes a disruption, I think, well, I didn't mean to do that. It was, and that's important. It's important to recognize our intention, because if we did mean to do that, that would that would need to be really transformed in us, right? If we had a harmful intention. So it's good if we don't have a harmful intention. That's very, very good. But it doesn't excuse what happened. If there was harm that happened, it's not enough to say, well, I didn't intend to do that. Of course, we want to forgive ourselves. You know, it's not about staying in a place of guilt or, you know, self-recrimination. But if what we have done has caused harm, we need to make amends. We need to acknowledge, yes, okay, I didn't mean it, but it had a harmful impact. So let me take responsibility for that harmful impact. Because what often happens is when we have privilege, if we step on the toes of people who don't have privilege and they say, you're stepping on my toes, we say, well, I didn't mean it. I wasn't intending to do that. That's not enough. We have to say, what can I do to help now that I've stepped on your toes? What can I do to make amends? Because the impact is real. You got your toes stepped on. Whether I meant it or not, that's not actually what's important. What's important now is that I take care that you were hurt. So let us not hide behind our intentions. Let's stand up and take accountability when harm happens. So I will now ask you, Sister D. Let us have a bell. Dear Sister D, could you please talk about how we can help each other touch our individual suffering, acknowledge it, and gain wisdom from it, so we don't continue to transmit the trauma of our history?
One of the important points that Sister True Jewel shared is that our biases and discriminations are learned. As children, as infants, when we just came to the world, we just wanted to be loved and to love. A woman a few months ago, she emailed me, she said, you know, she got pregnant, but it was an unwanted pregnancy and she didn't know whether she should go through with it. And then, you know, I offer her some counsel, pretty much about taking care of herself, just being true to where she was at so that she could live in peace with whatever decision that she made. And just yesterday, I received her email, and she said, Sister D, my son has arrived in this world, and he's a beautiful child, full of joy and love, but I'm still not sure whether I'm able to raise such a child, this beautiful child. And so I said to her, this child just wants love and to be loved. And he doesn't ask himself, do I deserve love? Or do you deserve to give me love? No, if you just give it to him, he'll just receive it. And so please make sure that you don't hold those complexes and then transfer it to him, those complexes to him. Just practice so that your mind is calm, your body is calm, so that your love can flow unobstructedly. So all of us have come into this world in that very way, just wide open for love. But as I shared earlier, very soon we learn whether we deserve love or we do not deserve love, whether we are wanted or we are not wanted, and how to best survive in the family and in the world. And so it's important to not feel ashamed. I think in our practice, it is to help us not to be ashamed, whether we are of an underprivileged group or a privileged group. Whether, like Mitchell Ratner shared yesterday, whether you are unemployed, somewhat employed, overemployed, or independently wealthy. We don't have to be ashamed of what we have, where we are at. Like my niece often said, she said, sharing is caring. We learn to recognize where we are, and however poor we may think we are or rich we may think we are, the more we care, the more we share, actually the wealthier and more free we become. In answering the question how we can help each other to touch our individual suffering and acknowledge it and gain wisdom from it, again, coming back to ourselves, being able to see what we have internalized in ourselves, our values or devalues, and to take care of them so that we don't perpetuate, we don't Okay, yes. So the practice helps us to recognize our suffering, our implicit and explicit biases, so that we don't continue to internalize them and to say, that's just me, that's how I feel, that's how I am, because then we become righteous towards those tendencies, but we are not aware of the root causes. Recently, during the pandemic, I finally went out, almost 1 year being in the monastery, I went out to a bank to cash my stimulus check. And as I was leaving the bank, crossing the, the parking lot, wearing a mask with this robe, and a man, he was must have been in his 60s or late 50s, and he looked out of his roll-down window in from his car, and he said, "You look scary, you look scary." And in that moment, I just froze for just a split of a second. And as I slowly removed my mask, I smiled and I said to him, and we were only a few steps away, I said, "Actually, I'm quite good looking." Actually, I'm quite good looking. But I'm a Buddhist nun, so I'm wearing this robe. And he was taken by surprise, by complete surprise. And he's like, oh, and he drove away. And I kept smiling on my way to the car. But later I realized, now, if I hadn't been a practitioner all these years, in that moment, if somebody screamed out of his window telling you, you look scary, and he was scared, I probably would have internalized that and felt bad about myself, that I look scary. Or I would have reacted. I may have said something unkind back to him. I don't know what I would have done, but I'm sure I was capable of doing anything. But in those moments, I was able to just pause for a moment, breathe, and use humor to de-escalate the fear and the tension in that man, in that stranger. And in myself, really, it was an act of compassion for myself, first and foremost, and then for that person. So in that way, it's so important for each one of us to be able to embrace ourselves, who we are, where we have been, what we have gone through, and to recognize and to acknowledge and to be at peace with that. Because that is the zone of mindfulness, that is the zone of protection that helps us not to allow ourselves to injure ourselves or to allow others to harm us, whether they're doing it intentionally or unintentionally. Nowadays, we talk a lot about trauma. For a long time, if something happens to somebody, we would say, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? Why is my child so withdrawn? Why is she so violent? All these, with the violent outbursts, etc. But now the society is shifting and being more aware. And the question, what happened? What happened to us as individuals? What happened to us as a society? How have we come to this point when there is so much hatred and anger and scapegoating? What have happened to us? So now we are taking a step further by not finger pointing, blaming what's wrong with you, but by asking the question, what we have gone through. In my own practice, I also see that it's not just what happened to us, but what has that incident, those views, those biases and discriminations done to our bodies, our feelings, our thoughts, our views, our worldview. What has those things done to us as individuals, as families, as societies, as the world? Things like, when particularly this pandemic, very early on it was called the Chinese flu, the Kung flu, the pandemic. Those people in power used irresponsibly words like that, blames like that, stereotypes like that. Those things, whether we say them jokingly or seriously, we plant seeds in ourselves and in each other, blames and hatred and anger. And so the results of all those discriminations and biases, we see very clearly many lives taken away senselessly because of that. Of course, it's not just from this pandemic, but all the history of the United States, of the history of humankind, whether we are of multi-racial nation or whether we are a homogeneous nation, we still hold discriminations and preferences, and we still oppress each other just on the basis of survival, but we call them with more noble terms, of course, for the idea of nationalism or nativism or whatever ism that is. We call them we give them noble terms, but it's all about survival for ourselves. And so when we learn, when we recognize this, we learn that it's not the individuals for survival anymore, but it's for all of us. Like the word pandemic, actually I learned, pan means all, and demic is demo, people, all people. Even one thought that we have, one little tiny virus that takes place, a thought is a virus. It's worse than a COVID virus. It affects not just one person, it affects all people. It's a pandemic. That awareness helps us to be more responsible for our thoughts, for our speech, and for our bodily actions. And we learn during this pandemic, for example, I spend more time to learn about different races. I learned about the first Chinese immigrants who came to this country, the first Japanese immigrants in this country, and I learned that the discrimination goes way back. I wasn't aware of it, that the first Chinese immigrant were referred to as the yellow plague, the yellow plague. And there were articles about building around a wall to keep the Chinese in that area. And my mind immediately associated with the wall along the Mexico border. So throughout history, when we feel threatened, when we are in turmoil, we will scapegoat. We will look for somebody to blame. And so in that way, there were Chinese people who were lynched when something happened to a person of the majority group. There were Chinese men who were hung. More than 10 of them were hung because one Chinese man was accused of having violated a white woman. And so in that way, the discrimination, the lynching, the separation, it was always there in our history of this country, in the history of humankind. Those are our tendencies, and we have to acknowledge them and make peace with them, to know that they are part of us. Just like this, there's in the light, there's the darkness. In us, there are good, positive, and the wholesome seeds, but we also have, all of us do, we have the negative seeds, the seeds that just think of oneself and want to further one's own advantages. But we realize that it affects all people, a pandemic of violence, of hatred, of discrimination towards ourselves, towards certain groups, towards Mother Earth, towards the animals, the plants. We all suffer. Eventually, in the end, all of us will suffer from those actions, from those thoughts. So for us to really grow and heal, I see that we need to provide the basic need of safety. For all of us to be able to feel safe, first of all, is to feel safe in ourselves. Actually, very often we're not safe in ourselves. We are constantly battling, struggling against ourselves, judging ourselves. We are not safe. And as a result, we cannot be safe for others. And so when we talk about the basic needs of a human being, of an infant, is to have a safe environment, to be fed, to be clothed, to be housed, but also to be loved. We continue to be infants. we have these basic needs. And now that we are able to feed and walk and to house ourselves, but we still need to provide these basic needs for safety and love. And yesterday, our brother talked about community-based practices that go along with the individual-based practices. I see that all of our mindfulness practices provide us this sense of safety. When we do sitting meditation, we sit with our breathing, we sit with our body, we sit with our feelings and with our thoughts, and we say to ourselves, I am here, I am here, I listen to you. I listen to you regardless of what's arising. I love you. I want to care better for you. So we create this environment of safety to hear ourselves for the first time, to listen to the tensions and the pain and the struggles within us for the first time. And we sit together as a community, and we feel safe because we know that others around us are also listening to their breathing, are also relaxing their bodies, and that people are also listening to their own suffering and doing their best to transform and heal their suffering. So in a community like this, we offer that energy of safety, whether we sit or we walk or we eat in silence or we share in a circle, and we allow each other to take turn to share and not to interject, not to interrupt, not to judge or criticize. That is what we are doing. We see ourselves as newborn Buddhas, and we offer ourselves and each other that safety, that environment of acceptance, of love, unconditionally, so that we can see more clearly the suffering within and slowly transform that suffering, and to transform, very importantly, the habitual thoughts of preferences and association and disassociation towards ourselves and towards the others, each other. So I see that from this pandemic, I learned one of the greatest lessons for me is about fear, how fear can really trigger our stress response systems, that we can, depending on what we have learned to cope earlier in life, depending on our personality, our predisposition, depending on the environment, we will either manifest the fighting behavior or the, trying to fight back or to flight, to run away from the situation, or just pretty much shut down and check out. There was a young woman, she shared, when the pandemic came around, I was so scared, I just checked out. I was not aware of anyone or anything going on around me anymore. And she lived in a community, and you could see that she was no longer in a community because she's so scared. She just blocked everything out and just do the basic small things in her daily life to just survive. And we see that in our society. There have been those of us who became more aggressive towards others, or those who have just become very withdrawn. And of course, with those fears, we usually water, perversely and unknowingly, we water more fears. We seek conservative social media. We search for those kind of news that will feed on our fear. And so as we learn to be aware of ourselves and of each other, we have to learn how has this pain, this fear, this obsession, this hatred festered? How have they been fed? And so we have to slowly those sources of feeding, of nutriments, so that they don't become stronger in us. For us, that's important to me. What our brother said yesterday, can you transform your habits by not feeding your fears and your discrimination and your biases and your unkind actions and speech and thoughts towards yourselves and others. And so, again, it is us who examine ourselves, who see others as our mirror images, that we gain understanding of how we have come to be the way we are, why we are thinking the way we are thinking, why we are doing the things that we are doing. And with that awareness, we help raise in our communities, in our world, collectively, and healing becomes possible because it starts with each of us as individuals, and naturally it becomes the collective awakening and healing and transformation. Thank you, dear CJ. So let us enjoy a sound of the bell before I ask a question to our sister. I see that it's already 9:35, so maybe I'll skip some questions because we have addressed quite a few issues already. So I'll ask you, if you are a bystander witnessing a situation of harm, how might we address that, or interrupt or intervene the hurtful or cruel behavior? This question made me think of Brother George Floyd, that there were people who were witnessing, even a child. And I just feel so much compassion for these people who witnessed that and felt so helpless. And I cannot imagine what that young person, that young child who witnessed the whole thing, what would his life, her life be? I hope that there are people out there to help this child and those people who had to visually, physically, viscerally witness that. So please share with us, what can we do to help each other in situations like that?
Thank you, sister. So, each of us will always be a bystander in some kind of way, where we are in a position where we're witnessing harm or discrimination or injustice. I mean, we're all bystanders as our country refuses to share the vaccine with people who are dying and need it all over the world. That not just our country, but this G7 meeting that decided, not to share the patent so that this vaccine could be. I know we are sharing the vaccines to some extent with other countries, but we could truly share. So we're bystanders to that. We're bystanders to the war in Yemen, how we continue to send arms to Saudi Arabia. We're all bystanders of injustice in so many different ways and so many levels of harm. And what we're all, this whole retreat, our whole order is about seeing our interbeing And if we're witnessing something, we're a part of it, whether we are, Bishop Tutu says, if you remain silent in the face of oppression, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. Now, it doesn't mean that in every situation, the right thing to do is intervene in that moment. Maybe you need to be silent in that moment and speak out later. That's more skillful. It may keep you safe. It may keep more people safe. But you can't just stay silent for good, right? Even if you can't intervene in the moment, how do you intervene later so that you're not somehow supporting that oppression by not speaking out, because we each have some influence. I know Dharma teachers in our community that refused to pay taxes for a long time until they were forced, either their center would be shut down or they wouldn't be able to serve people the way they needed to, but they tried to resist what they knew to be the evils that their tax money was going to. So it's a deep question. How do we be an active bystander? How do we be part of, we're all a part of harm happening. How do we lessen that harm and not benefit from it silently, unknowingly? I did some training when I lived in Washington, D.C. in self-defense. I became a self-defense trainer. And one of the things we also taught was how to be an active bystander, how to intervene in situations of harm, but keeping yourself safe, keeping the people around you safe. I was riding on a metro in DC, and behind me were two women speaking Spanish to each other. And there were some rowdy young people on the train one of them started to taunt these women by making fun of them speaking Spanish, and very loudly. And this made me very uncomfortable to see this kind of harassment happening. And what I had learned in some of the different strategies is to interrupt the harm. Sometimes that's by going to the person who's, creating the harm, but sometimes it's by giving your attention to the person who's receiving the harm. That can be more indirect. So I just turned around in my seat and I started talking to these two women. I didn't ignore the situation. I could have stayed safe in my, just blocked it out and pretended, I'm not going to get involved. But I turned around and I started speaking to them, and they spoke some English. I spoke to them in English. I asked them where were they going. I told them where I was going. I just made small talk so that the person making fun of them didn't have just the two of them as a target. I was somehow stepping in between just by talking to them. I wasn't doing anything to him. And he was surprised. He stopped, actually. And so it was also a way to express solidarity with the two of them by engaging them, by saying, I see you, I see the situation is happening, I'm here for you. And eventually he moved on. So one way, many of you may have seen that wonderful video of the chip eater on the New York subway. There's a couple that's starting to get physically fighting in a train, and he somehow, then the man is on one side, the woman's on the other side, but they're screaming at each other. He just stands in between them eating a bag of chips. Just blocks the energy, there's no way that they can see each other and that the energy can be quite as intense. So just his body, he didn't say anything, he didn't speak to either of them, but he's just calmly eating chips and blocking the space between the two of them. A very non-violent way to step in. So I think the best thing, because I know we're running, it's time to end. We'll put some references to helpful materials about how to understand what it is to be an active bystander, why it's important. Like, it matters a lot to people who are being victimized to know that people around them care. You know, one of the things about trauma is that it's not just what happens to us, it's what happens after the traumatic event. How were we responded to? Were there people there who cared about what happened? Sometimes it's that lack of care that's the actual trauma, not the event itself. So if people who are being victimized or being, harassed know that other people care about them, that can help a lot to not have the harm land so deeply. And it's also, whenever we interrupt or address, when we somehow engage, it's a huge teaching and corrective to whoever is acting harmfully. So it makes the communication, this is not okay, this isn't the culture I'm supporting, right? If people are silent, the person harassing, the person harming thinks they're in the right, no one's challenging them. So many good, important reasons to have some kind of training also about why we should try to do something. And we can do many things after if it's not appropriate to do something in the moment. But I'll share some of these resources, and there are online trainings, there are in-person trainings as well. I'm not someone who, most of us I think are not trained about how to be in experiences or interactions of conflict. And so it can be really helpful to, as we see our society becoming more and more polarized, and people becoming more and more desperate, that we actually invest in, training. And if I'm in this kind of scenario, how can I get support? How can I bring in a compassionate response? Thank you so much, dear Sister Dee, dear noble community, for this chance to share and learn and practice together.
I also would like to express my gratitude to our beloved community all over the world by making the commitment to be OI members. We learn to be aware of the disorder of interbeing that we are in, as was said yesterday, so that we can bring the wisdom of interbeing into our daily life. With awareness, we can use interbeing as a concentration in our daily life. We can see interbeing manifested in every aspect of our life, every kind of thought or speech or bodily actions. We can ask ourselves, do I see myself in others? Do I see the well-being of others in me? And vice versa. It is a thought that creates schism, division, or does it bring harmony to my body and mind, and to the body and mind of my families and societies? So in that way, it is a noble commitment that can be realized concretely in our daily practice. And it comes to my mind the teaching, the calligraphy that Thay often wrote, be beautiful, be yourself. How can we practice so that we see ourselves as truly beautiful, just the way we are. No more and no less. We can see the beauty in us. And how can we practice to see the beauties in others? When we can be at peace and in calmness and see beauty in ourselves and each other, we're less prone to judgments, to criticism, to harmful thought, speech, and bodily actions. Educate ourselves more. If you like to watch movies, to go to YouTube's, choose those documentaries and programs that educate us about other people, their cultures, their traditions, their suffering. In one particular video I watched about human trafficking, and this trafficker, when he was interviewed, he said that the traffickers would go to public spaces like an airport or a bus station, a train station, and then they would scout for young women, young girls who would be standing alone. That's the first target. And he would come to a young woman and he would say to her, "Your eyes look beautiful." And he said if that young woman looked at him back and smiled and said, "Thank you," then he said, "I have no chance and I'll move on." But if I walk towards another woman, young woman, and I said to her, "Your eyes look beautiful," and she looked down and she said, "No, they're not," then I know I got her. In many ways, we unknowingly, when we carry our pain, unresolved suffering, we make ourselves victims. We make ourselves perpetrators of the suffering. So to learn to be beautiful, to be ourselves, to accept, to be at peace with what we have been through, where we're at, where we're going, to be more proactive, more responsible, we see that we are beautiful. And others cannot take us down, cannot bring harm to us, because we know how to protect ourselves and each other from harm's way. So with that, dear beloved community, thank you for being there. Thank you for your genuine, sincere practice. And thank you for contributing goodness and love and beauty to our society, to our world. please take a moment to massage our hands and knees and feet and give thanks to our body.
So dear Thay, dear community, please join me in offering flowers for our teachers, Sister D and Kaira Jewel. So much gratitude. Just a reminder that in keeping with our awareness that the teachings are freely given and our practice of offering gratitude in the form of dana, when we're able and moved to do so, please know that it's possible to offer dana for Kaira Jewel in several different ways. So we invite you to visit the Teachable site and Kaira Jewel's bio, where there's much more information. And she also just asked me to share that for those for whom this is appropriate and relevant, you'll find also with her bio on Teachable more information on on a weekly BIPOC meditation group facilitated by Kaira Jewel, I think also by Maricela Gomez, I'm not sure. So check that out if that's of interest. 2 wonderful events coming up today. At 2:30 p.m. Eastern, so 11:30 a.m. Pacific, please check your schedule and for your time zone to make sure you have the right time. We have an opportunity to hear from our siblings in the Arise Sangha. For those who may not be familiar with Arise, the full name is Awakening Through Race, Intersectionality, and Social Equity. This is an opportunity to learn more about the ways in which this beautiful cell in our larger Sangha body is supporting all of us in cultivating a more welcoming, open, and equitable community. And at 7:30 Eastern this evening, 4:30 in Pacific time, again, check your schedules. We have an opportunity to go deeper into some of what Joanne Rosen was sharing with us in the talk last night. Several of our OI siblings will help us get a deeper understanding of the nervous system, trauma, and resilience from their perspectives, both as professionals in the field and also from their Plum Village practice. So we wish you a day of ease and hopefully you're having a nourishing retreat. Thank you so much.